Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Katie Bray, and I am Involvement and Engagement Manager here at Alzheimer's Research UK. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to In Conversation at Christmas 2024. With our speakers today, we'll be looking back on the past year and what's been happening in dementia research. Before we get into the discussion, I've just got a few little bits of housekeeping. During the event, you're welcome to switch on the subtitles using the CC button at the bottom of your screen. And these subtitles are generated automatically, and so they're not 100% accurate during the live event, but they will be edited so they are correct on the event recording. After the event, we will send you a link to the event recording, which you'll be able to watch over on our website and on our YouTube channel. This is also where you'll be able to find all the previous event recordings like this. And today we'll be answering a mix of pre-submitted questions and live questions. And if you would like to ask a question during the discussion, you just need to click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, which will bring up the box where you can type your question. And we've received lots of fantastic questions ahead of the event, and we'll try and answer as many of these as possible during the discussion. It is important to note that we aren't able to offer any personal medical advice or answer any personal medical questions during the event. So now we're going to ask you some poll questions so we can find out just a little bit more about you. Whilst these events are great and that you can, do them from the comfort of your home, it does mean that sadly we don't get to see you. So this just helps us understand a little bit more about who's coming along today. So you can start to complete those. Now they've popped up, and we're just interested to know your rate of how you'd rate your knowledge of dementia research. And your reasons for attending today. So is it you've got a loved one with dementia, your work is related to dementia, you care for someone, you have dementia yourself, or actually you don't really have a personal connection, but you're just simply interested. And we also like to find out whether this is your first event like this that you've come to. Typically, we often get a mix, but it's always useful to know that. So I'll just pause as I can see those responses coming through now. It looks like we've got a mix, I would say. So people feeling they have an average to high current knowledge of dementia research. Hopefully after today's discussion, you'll feel you know a little bit more about the topics. And we have another mix, I would say, of people who are coming along because they maybe have experience of dementia within their friends and family, and their work is related to dementia. So I think, yeah, we've got some good responses there. So we could close the poll and move on. So we've got a mix of first time and returning attendees, and welcome to you all. For those of you who are newer to these events, I'll briefly introduce Alzheimer's Research UK. So we are the UK's leading dementia research charity, and we're currently supporting over £50 million of research. We're working to revolutionise the way that we treat, diagnose and prevent dementia by investing in the best research, powering the most forward-thinking scientists and joining forces with world-class organisations. But all of this is only possible thanks to our amazing supporters who donate, fundraise, volunteer and raise awareness of our work, plus so much more. And with your support, we will keep going until every person is free from the heartbreak of dementia. And so today's event is part of our series where we bring you researchers, and it's a chance really to hear about some of the research we're funding, our wider work as well, all to improve the lives of everyone affected by dementia. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our guest today. And first up, we have Professor Vanessa Raymont, who is both a medical doctor and a researcher based at the University of Oxford. So, Vanessa, if you could tell us just a little bit more about yourself.
Thank you, Katie, and thanks ever so much for having me here today. So I'm an old age psychiatrist by training. I've been working in dementia research and clinics for 30 years, actually. So seen lots of changes, but really pleased that we're seeing a lot of the research coming to fruition finally. So looking forward to talking about more of that today. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, Vanessa. And next up, it's my pleasure to introduce Jordan Adams, who is quite hot off the press, a new ambassador for Alzheimer's Research UK. And he's been a dedicated supporter for a number of years due to the impact dementia has had on his life. Jordan, could you tell us just a little bit about yourself?
Sure, yeah. Thank you again, Katie, for having me today. I'm Jordan Adams. I'm 29 and I'm one half of the FTD brothers. FTD, if you don't know, stands for frontotemporal dementia. So sadly, my family has been completely devastated by a familial genetic mutation, the MAPT mutation, which means my mum, my auntie, and 11 of their relatives have all lost their lives to this type of familial FTD. And myself and my brother found out in the last few years that we're also carriers of this genetic mutation. So ultimately, that means we're going to get symptoms of dementia in the next 15 years. Um, so I've dedicated my life towards raising as much awareness and funds towards groundbreaking research in the hope that we can find a cure. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Fab. Thank you, Jordan. Great to have you on. And rounding up our lineup is David Thomas, who is Head of Policy and Public Affairs here at Alzheimer's Research UK. David, can you tell us a little bit more about your work?
Thanks, Katie, and hi. Good to be here with everyone today. So my work is to lead on behalf of Alzheimer's Research UK our activities to shape government and their approach to dementia and to work with in the political world. And a few of our priorities are things like getting more investment into dementia research from the government, but we're also working really hard to make sure that when we do have new innovations that research generates, like new treatments or new diagnostics, that patients and people in the UK can benefit from them in practice.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. Right, so we have about 35, 40 minutes for a discussion, and I know we've got lots to cover because it's been a really big year, really, for dementia research. There's a lot of things have happened. But starting off in the spring, we'll think a little bit about diagnosis now. So starting off in the spring, we saw the announcement of some new funding for research into blood tests for dementia. And this has been an area that there's been a growing interest in recent years. And Vanessa, you actually lead one of these projects that was funded through the Blood Biomarker Challenge, of which Alzheimer's Research UK is a part. So Vanessa, could you tell us a little bit about what your study is setting out to do, investigating blood tests for dementia?
No, absolutely, Katie. And as you said, it's a very exciting time, as I mentioned earlier, because previously the proteins that these blood tests are measuring were really only reliably measurable through things like lumbar punctures, so measuring the cerebral spinal fluid, or a PET scan, so a particular type of scan where you look at receptors in the brain, which obviously are quite difficult tests to do, quite costly, not available in all areas. So the study that I'm running called Readout, there's another study called Adapt, are looking at the clinical utility. So how practically useful are the blood test version of these tests in the general population. And particularly for our study, we're actually looking at a range of these new plasma biomarkers, as they're called, so ways of measuring these proteins, to see not only how accurate they are in different groups of people. So one of the concerns has been, although these blood tests seem pretty accurate, we don't have enough data in a really representative population, so people like the very elderly in certain underrepresented groups. But also, do they actually add value to our clinical services? So the project that we're running is looking at both of those. So it's looking at a panel, a group of biomarkers to see whether they are useful in detecting diseases that can cause dementia, so that's Alzheimer's disease, but other diseases as well. And what's the impact that giving these results has to people? Is there a better way to to pass on those results? But also, as I said, what does it add in terms of cost and benefit to the healthcare system? So over the next few years, is this something that we can really roll out across the NHS?
Fab. And so you said for all types of dementia, so often we hear quite a lot about Alzheimer's because it is the most current form. But it sounds like your study is actually looking at different types of dementia. And is it that there'll be different things that you're looking for on these blood tests for these different types?
Absolutely. We know that there are some common tests that seem to look at general changes in the brain, neurodegeneration that happens across all types of dementia. But then there are some of these tests that are very specific, seem to be better at picking up Alzheimer's disease. We're starting to know more about tests that are particularly good at picking up frontotemporal dementia, for instance. So our study will look at a range of those. But also, is there a particular combination that works best? Because at the end of the day, we do want these tests to be as accessible as possible. And so do we need a certain panel of tests to begin with to screen people in memory clinics, for instance? And actually then you need to refine those tests once you get sure about what the diagnosis is.
Lovely. And so this study you're doing, it lasts for a number of years. What's the end point for it? And then what happens after that, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, because so much at the time in research, we maybe come out with a really good piece of information, but then the question is, how does it actually get to patients? So there are two halves to our study. So the first half, we're collecting blood tests from a really large number of people, so just over 3,000 people. So we get all of that representative data that I mentioned. Hopefully we'll be starting testing this week, actually, just before Christmas, which would be great. And then we'll do what's called a randomized controlled trial, where we will look at the benefit of receiving information about your blood biomarker status or not. And as I said, what's the best way to receive that? And also, how useful is it to do blood tests remotely, for instance? Because obviously that would be even more accessible for people. But the key bit, I think, for this study, and this is in our study readout, but also in the ADAPT study, is we have what's called a health economic arm, which, as I said, will look at the wider costs that people incur if they are suffering from memory problems and need extra help at home, for instance. All of that goes into a clever bit of modelling to work out what the costs are that will then enable us to work with commissioners that pay for local NHS services to say, as this can be rolled out. So what we're hoping at the end is we'll actually have a plan of the types of tests, where and how they should be rolled out. And as I said, are they something we can start to deliver in real world sites at the end of the study? And we're working with some commissioners from the design now, so we're hoping this will be as efficient as possible. And at the end, we will have these blood tests, if they are beneficial, as accessible to everyone as possible.
Fab. And I guess that's the point at which, David, it becomes your realm of work. So the evidence that Vanessa's gathering helps you build the case for, these tests being available in the NHS. But what kind of, from a policy perspective, how does it go from having that evidence to actually being with people in kind of doctor surgeries?
Yeah, and I think we can't underestimate the sort of sea change that this will represent for diagnosis. That we know that a third of people with dementia never receive a diagnosis at all, and the majority of cases of dementia are diagnosed largely based on observation of symptoms rather than looking at the biological changes that are happening in the body, which is exactly the sort of thing that these blood tests would be looking at. And there is huge variation across the NHS. Some areas do really well at this, some areas do less well. In some places people have to wait a very long time. So that is how we tackle some of these issues is a really big challenge. When I think, as we all know, the NHS is facing lots of other big pressures. So the evidence that Vanessa and team are collecting is really important to that, because we need to give what my team and what Alzheimer's research will be doing is that conversation with government and with the NHS about how does the way that you organise services need to change to reflect these new tests. And also, what does it mean for clinicians, for clinicians who might be less research active than others, who don't have a good understanding of the kind of what's on the horizon, and what will this mean for their clinical practice? How do they use these tests? There's a whole host of different pieces that are involved, and the NHS is it's a big institution, so change is like turning a supertanker. So there's a really important work that we need to do both at the national level and then with clinicians locally to make sure that the tests that are increasingly being used in research as kind of standard are able to benefit people from in the NHS. And I think one of the ways that we do that is exactly as Vanessa's talked about, through producing this evidence which really credibly shows the benefit that these tests would bring, and also the changes we need to see so that they're used appropriately in clinical practice.
Thank you, David. Yeah. And Jordan, I just wonder, coming to you, what your experience in your family has been of getting a diagnosis, and, what would some of these improvements in technology actually offer in those situations that you've experienced?
Sure, I think David touched on it there. I think my mom's diagnosis ultimately came from an observation of her symptoms rather than, studying kind of the biological effects of the disease. And I think that's why the improvement in these diagnostic tools is so important. As again, David said there, 1 in 3 people who live with a form of dementia are never formally diagnosed. And that's quite scary, really. They're quite staggering, the amount of people up and down the UK who are living with dementia and never get that diagnosis, because moving forward, hopefully when, these new treatments come to light over the next decade, people are diagnosed earlier so they can be treated earlier, and that's the point that we want to get to. And obviously, David there explaining a bit about how the policy end works is vitally important too, that the clinicians know exactly how to use these tests in the best possible way, and if we can make it more accessible for people to utilize this testing across the NHS, then it's only going to be a positive moving forward over the next, I would say, 10-15 years. So yeah, it'd be fantastic.
Fab. And just asking about your experience with your mother, was it a relatively quick process, or did it take quite a lot of time actually to get an accurate diagnosis for her?
Sure, with my mum, it took a long time, a period, I would say, of 18 months to 2 years. We as a family could identify that something wasn't right with mum in terms of her behaviour had changed, cognitive function had kind of worsened, and my dad had to really push via his GP to get some answers. A few of the early kind of diagnosis was mum was given diagnosis with depression, which seems to be quite common, having spoken to other people who've had a similar experience. And then it wasn't until we pushed to see a specialist at Birmingham Women's Hospital that we eventually got mum's diagnosis in June 2010, where she was formally diagnosed with frontotemporal dementia. But obviously, it was probably advantageous to clinicians at that time, seeing the abnormal family history, the pattern of family history that we have with the disease, to be able to give mum a diagnosis. I think it's far more difficult, for those who don't have that kind of genetic mutation, to have a look at, family history, something that they probably relied on in my mum's case. And as I say, probably observe my mum's symptoms rather than looking at the biological effects.
I think that is a story that we hear quite a lot of the time, and the kind of having to gather a lot of evidence to really make that case. And actually, we are currently doing a survey to gather experiences like yours, Jordan, of diagnosis, particularly from the last 3 years. So I think my colleagues can share a link in the chat. This survey's open for 2 more days. And this is just helping us to build that kind of bigger picture of the stories of people seeking a diagnosis. It's going to help us work out kind of different areas of our work where we can push for change and drive that change that we so want to see. Yeah, so moving on a little bit from diagnosis, I think I'm going to move to the one where I would say was a really landmark story of the year. So we've not seen any new drugs licensed for any form of dementia for 20 years. And then this year we had 2. There was lecanemab and donanemab, and they're not the easiest names to say, but it's very exciting that they did receive a license. However, they weren't then approved on the NHS for use on the NHS. And I think a lot of the time the assumption there is it's simply cost. But I wonder, David, if I come to you on this question first, is it simply a matter of how much these treatments cost, or are there other factors to do with the NHS, to do with access and pathways that need to be considered and changed as well?
Yeah, and I think it is a long and winding road to approve medicines, particularly medicines that are like these 2 drugs that are in an area where we haven't had treatments. They are new, and it's not enough simply to have good clinical trial results. The UK has a body called the MHRA, which looks at those results and makes a decision about whether are they safe and are they effective. And with these 2 drugs, we have seen that. So that is the really exciting exciting thing that's happened this year. But after that, the NHS then needs to decide whether it can afford to pay for these drugs. So the NHS has a fixed budget. It is an organisation, as I said earlier, is dealing with lots of different pressures. So what the NHS does is they've asked a body called NICE, and they operate in England and Wales, but there's also a separate body in Scotland called the SMC. Lots of acronyms in this space. And they take a look at the benefits that the drugs bring, but also the costs. And when I say costs, I don't just mean the price of the drug itself, but also by implementing that drug, what will it cost the NHS to do that? So with these 2 particular drugs, they're given by infusion, which is into the vein via an IV. So that obviously takes money and space for the NHS to do that. There are some safety issues with these drugs that really need to be carefully looked at. So that needs to be factored into the cost in terms of the the kind of diagnostic monitoring that would be required for that. So the NHS basically judges all those different factors against the benefits that the drug has shown in clinical trial to decide whether that drug is cost effective. With these two particular drugs right now, the initial decision is that they've said that they aren't cost effective, but there are ongoing conversations sort of behind the scenes with the manufacturers of both these drugs, and a second committee session planned by NICE to look at this in January for one of the drugs. So we haven't got a final decision yet, but it's something obviously we're looking at very carefully. Even if the NHS then decides to fund these drugs, there's a big question about how you can roll this out across clinics, in the UK, because there are lots of challenges. This again represents a really big change to the way the NHS is organised to give these drugs, to find the capacity, to find the staff who can give them, and crucially, linking back to our last conversation, this is all about early and accurate diagnosis. Because to benefit from these drugs, you need to receive them at an early stage of Alzheimer's disease, and you also need to have an accurate diagnosis. It's not enough to say dementia; it needs to be early Alzheimer's disease. So using the sorts of molecular diagnostics, the diagnostics that are looking at changes in your biology, that is essential to this, and that's not the routine way of operating at the moment within the NHS. So that is something that we need to see change, and when we do have blood tests, that will really help with that. In the meantime, it means either using a PET scanner, and PET scanners are expensive and few and far between in the NHS, or taking a sample from the spine of spinal fluid, which obviously people for good reason don't want to do that unless they really have to. So there are some big changes we need to see, but nonetheless, I think that we are this is a step forward for us, and there's lots more work to do. But I think that these drugs are going to be a foundation to build on. So hopefully we'll end up with a range of different treatment options for everyone with dementia.
Mm. And drawing on that last point, David, for everyone with dementia, so these two drugs are for Alzheimer's disease. And as I said earlier, we often hear mostly about that type of dementia. But I wonder, Vanessa, if you could just give a bit of an insight into the kind of the broader picture of, are there other treatments in studies, late phase clinical trials for these other types of dementia? Is it just about Alzheimer's, or what else is happening?
No, definitely not. As you said, these two drugs coming to market, as you said, first new drugs for 30 years means there's been a massive amount of research in Alzheimer's disease, but also obviously, yes, in other types of dementia as well. And a lot is changing. I mean, I think we're starting to understand common things that go on in the brain across dementias. So things like inflammation seems particularly important. So some of the focus for other forms of dementia around drugs that manage inflammation. So there's been a new drug recently, for instance, for Lewy body dementia that's actually previously used in rheumatoid arthritis, and seems to show a lot of promise in handling inflammation and therefore having an impact on Lewy body dementia. Another area that's getting a lot of interest is looking at how we can affect gene processes. So actually the actual genetics that cause certain proteins to be developed and produced in the brain in the first place. So for frontotemporal dementia particularly, there's a drive to look at particular genetic type drugs. So there's a lot happening in those areas. I think a lot of people feel things like vascular dementia is an area that lacks a lot of research and is very, very common. The next most common form of dementia after Alzheimer's disease. There's a lot of people looking actually at what we call repurposed drugs. So drugs that already exist for other conditions. I've already mentioned the drug for rheumatoid arthritis that's showing promise in Lewy body dementia. There's a number of drugs that are being looked at for vascular dementia. So something called semaglutide, which some people will have heard of. This has been in the news a lot lately about how it could help people with obesity, but it also seems to be showing promise in terms of treatment for vascular dementia. And also drugs that are used for high blood pressure is again another area of interest for vascular dementia. So there's a lot going on. And I think, as I said, we're starting to see even more research, not only just on new drugs, but also drugs that we already have, and they be useful in different indications, particularly for these other forms of memory disorder.
Thank you. And I guess one of the things that's really important for this progress to happen is actually people taking part in research. And I know, Jordan, this is something you're really passionate about. You're part of the study yourself. Could you talk to us just a little bit about your experience of taking part in research and what it means to you and what it can do for society?
Sure. So a year after my diagnosis in 2018, I decided to become actively involved in a research study that's for familial frontotemporal dementia. So it's the GENFI research study based out of University Colleges of London. And I go for an annual visit each year where they take blood. So I have a number of different cognitive tests each year. There's different technology kind of increasingly available in terms of different tests on the iPad, eye tracking tests. Biannually, I have a lumbar puncture, so my spinal fluid is taken, and it's good for myself and my brother, who went for the first time this year, to be more informed about the types of research that's going on, particularly in the space for familial FTD. We get to have kind of a one-on-one with the head of the study, Professor Jonathan Rower, and to be honest, it gives us a lot of hope for the future. In those conversations that I've had earlier this year, he was very positive about over the next 2 or 3 years there will be clinical trials that come to light that myself and my brother may be able to take part in, and obviously from that, we may be within touching distance of a treatment that could benefit us. So yeah, more than anything, I think it's good for us to stay informed and know exactly what's going on in that space.
Fab. Yeah, I think that's a really good kind of description of what it can mean on a personal level to take part in a lot of these studies. And if anybody's watching and they're interested in finding out more about taking part in studies, there's something called Join Dementia Research, and I'm sure my colleagues will pop a link to that in the chat, and we'll share more about that later on. But this is a really easy way to kind of share your interest, join up and say, I'm interested in finding out more, and then people running studies can get in touch if they're looking for people like you. And it's open to anyone over the age of 18, whether or not you have a diagnosis of dementia, because we need to look at groups both with and without to really understand what's happening in this condition. So yeah, do check out Join Dementia Research. So I'm kind of swiftly moving through, but actually I want to draw on something that Vanessa was talking a bit about, I guess, heart health and its role in dementia. And that brings us on to thinking about risk factors for dementia. And I would say this is something that actually we get the most interest in, is about risk factors for dementia. So Vanessa, I'm going to come to you first. Could you just talk us through, what makes up the risk of dementia? We probably know there's a bit of genes, a bit of lifestyle, but could you just tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, obviously there are certain forms of dementia, obviously that Jordan's been affected by, that we know there are specific genes that are very, very important and probably the primary reason on why people are affected by those forms. But for most forms of dementia, they're what we call sporadic. So in terms of Alzheimer's disease, the commonest form, most people are affected by what's known as sporadic Alzheimer's disease. So although we know that there is a particular gene, ApoE4, that seems to be the one that causes most risk for developing sporadic Alzheimer's disease, it's not actually the main driver for most people. So about 25% of people have a copy of this gene, but actually it only there's only 15% of cases of Alzheimer's disease where that's the primary cause. So for most people who develop dementia, there's probably some genetic predisposition in some families, but it's much more about lifestyle and other factors that we still don't really understand. There was a paper that came out this year, or was updated this year, by the Lancet Commission, which looked at risk factors for dementia. And this actually first came out about 4 years ago now, and it's been updated since. What was really telling about this was they actually pulled all the research together about that people had looked at about wider lifestyle factors, and predicted that 45% of dementias could be preventable if we manage those lifestyle risk factors better. And I think this is absolutely amazing when you think about the sheer numbers of people involved. So what's that suggesting is, even if you had one of these ApoE4 genetic markers, you can still do something about your likelihood of developing dementia if you manage these risk factors better. And I mean, the most common risk factor in terms of impact was hearing loss, which is something, unfortunately, most of us experience as we get older, is something potentially that can be very manageable in terms of hearing aids. And so something very simple that we can all do. So in terms of us understanding for most people how much of their risks are around lifestyle versus genetics versus other inherent things, we're still not quite clear. But the reality is there's probably a lot we can do with those risk factors. And hopefully that's, again, a very promising area that we can think about more in terms of management in the future.
Thank you. And we did get a question ahead of time about whether you can access testing for genes to do with dementia via the NHS. And I think it's worth, I'll come back to you, Vanessa, on this one about offering genetic testing and the difference maybe between those genes involved with sporadic dementia and the genes involved with the more inherited forms. So yeah, what can the NHS offer on that at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, certainly for people that are felt to be at risk of one of the familial forms of dementia, then absolutely those genetic markers can be tested on the NHS. For sporadic testing, that's done much more rarely, and on the whole isn't widely available on the NHS. I do think that that may well change over the next few years, because the two drugs that we've mentioned that have come onto the market this year, there are increased risks of taking those if you have 2 copies of this ApoE4 gene, for instance. So, in fact, our regulators in this country, the MHRA, said that we shouldn't prescribe those drugs for people who have 2 copies. So I think over the next couple of years, probably some of this genetic testing will be more widely available. The bottom line is, if you want to test your ApoE4 status, as I said, which is the one that's more common for sporadic Alzheimer's disease, there won't be many centres. There will be some that you can get that in, but not many on the NHS. But I think that will probably be changing as it becomes more important for how people respond to treatments as well.
Thank you. And Jordan, I was just going to come to you, because I think when people say, can I get a test? They think it's as simple as just going to the doctor and saying, I would like a test. But actually, in your experience, what is involved when you have one of these familial forms with finding out more information about your genes?
Sure, it's a very common question that I get since being an advocate for AR UK. Many people will kind of come to me and ask where they can get tested. Obviously, the slight difference with our case is that familial cases like ours that are caused by faulty genetics only represent 1% of all dementia cases. So our circumstances are extremely rare. To put that into perspective for those in on this, it's completely devastated my family, as I said earlier. So going back to my nan's generation, she was one of 6 siblings. 4 of those carried the faulty MAPT gene and have all lost their lives to frontotemporal dementia. Then there was obviously my mum's generation and her sister. They were 2 of 13 cousins, and 8 of those live with frontotemporal dementia. And it's because of that pattern, that abnormal pattern, that you can see that genetic testing was available to myself and my siblings. So we took up that option, which was available to us via the NHS at Birmingham Women's Hospital, where we were fortunate to have a very good service there. Our experience through our genetic counsellor was second to none. I cannot say that enough, but unfortunately that's not the case for everybody. And again, even though I'll go back to it being a very rare set of circumstances, it's something that I'd like to see improved in terms of a service that's more widely available. It's a bit of a postcode lottery in terms of where you live and whether you can get the access to those services that have obviously given us the knowledge that we know now, because it is so powerful. Me and my brother obviously learned that we're carriers of the gene, but it's made us more informed, and obviously given us the power to make decisions for the future and hopefully make a difference. Hence why I'm here today talking about my own experiences. But yeah, so hopefully that's something that can improve in the future.
Thank you, Jordan. And sticking with you, Jordan, you this year did a massive challenge amongst many, actually. But the one that I really want to highlight is where you and your brother ran from John O'Groats to Land's End, so the length of this island that we're on right now. And that's a huge challenge. Was that simply for you about raising money and awareness, or is there, just physical exercise in your health? What does that mean to you, knowing your genetic status?
Sure. So when I talk about, again, kind of the familial devastation of it, all of my relatives, apart from one, have had symptoms in their mid to late 40s. There was one outlier who didn't start to get symptoms until his late 50s, early 60s. And he happened to be somebody who was very cardiovascularly fit, exercised a lot. And without reading too much into it, obviously there's not been any sort of research study into that. But the benefits that it also gives me as a coping mechanism to deal with my genetic circumstances means that it's a tool that I've used above any other in terms to keep me fit, mentally active, and things like that. So yeah, running is something, and as well as going to the gym or keeping fit, that I recommend to anybody to kind of lessen their risk of getting a type of dementia. And it's something that, as I say, me and my brother have obviously used to as a vehicle to raise as much money and awareness about different types of dementia over the last 6 years. So yeah, we ran the entire length of the UK in September, raising vital funds for AI UK. And actually this Friday, I'm capping the year off, hopefully in style, by running 982 laps of my local athletics track in 3 days. So to put some perspective into that, that's 245 miles in 72 hours. To represent the 982,000 people currently living with dementia all across the UK. We're currently just over £242,000 raised in the calendar year. And this last challenge of 2024 is to hopefully push our fundraising over £250,000 raised for a cure this year. And as I say, towards our £1 million target towards groundbreaking research before we get frontotemporal dementia that, as I say, has devastated our family. So yeah, definitely something that I would recommend to anybody keeping fit, and running's been an amazing tool for myself and my brother.
Brilliant. And yeah, good luck for Friday. I think most people by Friday will just be thinking, I might just put my feet up for Christmas. But yeah, no, that's an absolutely phenomenal effort from you, Jordan. So thank you. David, I want to flip this dementia risk question a little bit and think a bit more broadly. So often we talk about those things that we can do as individuals, but actually, are there things that your team is talking to the government about, to policymakers, that could be done at a more broad societal level that could impact everybody's risk of dementia?
Yeah, and I think this is one of my reasons for being cheerful, is the research that is increasingly strong and robust in this area. And Vanessa mentioned it earlier, the work that was published in the Lancet over the summer that shows how strong the evidence base is that there are things we can do to reduce the number of dementia cases effectively through prevention and risk reduction. So. And at the same time, we've got a health service which I think everyone knows is really struggling. There is such demand for care. People living longer with lots of different complicated conditions that just are resulting in a lot of these pressures and waiting time pressures and so on. So so the government is looking right now at how we can prevent ill health from happening, because they know it will relieve those pressures on the NHS and on the state more widely when we think about people who are living on long-term sick benefits because of the conditions they're living with. So there's a big opportunity here, I think, as a society, for us to think about what can we do about this at scale to really lower these numbers. And I think there's a the variety of different risk factors that we've highlighted today. Some of it is around how we enable individuals to look after themselves. We talk a lot at Alzheimer's Research UK about looking after your brain health in the same way you look after your heart health. So that's not smoking, drinking less, doing more exercise. But there are also some things which are beyond individuals' control. So the quality of air, for example, is identified as a risk factor. So if you live in an area of poor air quality, you're more at risk of getting dementia than someone living in an area with much cleaner air. And that's not something that individuals can act on. So what we've been saying to government is, you really need to have a joined up approach on this, because it isn't just about the NHS. There's definitely a role for the NHS in helping people to identify risk and take the right actions. But some of it is about the wider factors of how we live our lives, where we live, what jobs we've got. There's a whole host of different things that are relevant here. So it really needs government to work in a way that government has traditionally found quite hard to work, which is a joined up way, which is bringing together different departments and different industries and sectors to have a plan for how we reduce the harm and heartbreak that dementia is causing as part of the wider efforts to prevent ill health. So the government right now are looking at their 10-year health strategy for the future of the NHS. So we are saying this needs to be a really critical part of it, because there's a big opportunity here if they choose to take it.
Fab, thank you. Aware of time, so I'm just trying to think of maybe a quick one and then a final question, but maybe I'll just give us a bit more time for looking ahead. So this time of year, I don't know about other people, but I get very reflective, and I think also ahead to the next year and what's on the horizon. So we've seen some really big news stories this year in the dementia research space, but actually, what's coming next year? And I'll come to each of my panelists in turn, but I don't know if anybody particularly wants to go first. So, what's on the horizon that excites you, or is a reason to be cheerful, or gives you hope, or that you're looking to achieve in your area next year?
I'm happy to go first.
Thank you, David.
Give my other panelists a moment to reflect on that. And I think we've touched on it, but I think to recognise the catalyst that these two new treatments represent, they are not wonder drugs. There's lots that is challenging, and the benefits from what we can see at the moment is modest. But to have two treatments that are actually affecting the course of Alzheimer's disease, is a really important moment. And so I'm really excited about, exactly as Vanessa was talking about, it's led to this, the increase in investment, the increase in momentum of the wider pipeline of a whole range of different treatments that I think really means that, over the next year and, years to come after that, we're going to see dementia moving into more of the space where cancer is right now, where you do have a whole host of different treatments and new treatments, new innovative treatments, new really exciting treatments becoming available all the time. That also with them, I think, will drive a lot of improvements to how we diagnose people, to how the sorts of care and support that people receive within the NHS and social care more widely. So that is a really exciting piece, and I think we're Alzheimer's Research UK. I think we can also recognise the UK is really good at this. We have some top researchers in this country. We have some fantastic institutions that can really on the global stage I think make this a country which can really lead in this space. So that is something which I'm very excited about, seeing how we can really capitalize on that in the year to come.
Thank you, David. Vanessa or Jordan? Vanessa, do you want to go?
I'm happy to follow up on that, yes. Yeah, I mean, I really just echo actually what David said. I think we cannot underestimate how important these two drugs are, even though there's obviously a lot of controversy about the cost, how easy they are to roll out, how easy they are to give, side effects, etc. These are the first new drugs for 30 years and the first drugs that seem to really change the course of disease. So that's momentous. And I think the other thing, as David said, is it's how they open the door, not only for other new treatments, but for changes in services. I think we're all very aware that, as we said, a third of people still don't get a diagnosis. We have an awful long way to go to feel we're offering services similar to the services people have when they're diagnosed with cancer. But I think this starts to drive real change, because when there's a treatment, even for however many people, that drives the change. I think the other thing I'd just highlight that we haven't touched on is the prospect of digital technology around diagnosis, and also things like monitoring response to treatments. So there's a lot of talk at the moment about, now we are getting close to having blood tests that are accurate enough to use in clinical services. Are those then even more accurate, even more useful if you combine it with a quick test that you could do on your phone or on your laptop? Now, again, we've always wanted to be really careful about this, because we want to make sure these tests are, again, as accessible as possible to everybody. But I think that's where we're heading. We're heading where we'll all be doing more of these types of tests on our phones or whatever equipment we can access. Having blood tests, those will be useful for diagnosis, but also, as I said, monitoring our response to treatments. So hopefully this, again, just makes all of those management tools even more accessible to as many people as possible.
Fab, thank you, Vanessa. And Jordan, 2025, what's in store?
Sure. I mean, just to reflect on the year we've had, as both David and Vanessa have mentioned, I think it's been truly groundbreaking, having those two treatments come to light. And it is important to remember that this is just the start over the next decade for new treatments to become available. But moving more into the spaces as a supporter and an ambassador for AR UK, I'm very excited about pushing for societal change. Myself and my brother are very big on moving into a space, particularly of young people going into schools and using our social platform that myself and my brother have built over the last 12 months, doing these challenges to reaffirm the messages and take away the stigma surrounded by dementia. Whilst the amazing research is going on in the background, we want to continue to send messages about, people, the key risk factors, becoming more cardiovascularly healthy, and just raising as much awareness and hopefully more exciting projects where we'll raise more money towards Alzheimer's Research UK, so we get closer to treatments and things that will benefit those affected by dementia in the future.
Fab, thank you. Well, it's been the time's really flown. We probably could have stayed on for another few hours talking about all the questions come through, all that came through in advance. But to keep it short and digestible, we'll wrap it up there. But a huge thank you to my 3 speakers, to Vanessa, Jordan and David. Thank you for coming along. We'll say goodbye to you now, but if everybody else holds on, because I've got a little bit more information, but thank you to our 3 panelists.
Thank you.
All right. So yes, as I said, please stick with me because we firstly want to get a bit of feedback. So we're just going to pop a poll up on screen now. Just to find out how you found today's discussion. You know, was the content too technical, about right, too simple? Would you recommend these to anyone you know, to your friends and your family? And do you feel you've learned something today? So I'll just pause just for a second while I give everybody a chance to fill those in. And this feedback's really valuable. So this is an initial poll. We'll also be sending a more detailed feedback survey to you later today. So please do share any comments with us. We're always keen to learn and grow the series to make sure we're actually answering the questions and talking about the topics that matter to you and doing it in the best way possible. So do look out for that email later today. Just see everyone's kind of responses coming through. And it's always a bit nervous for me. My team puts these on. We've done these for a number of years now. We hope we're getting them right, but it looks like the feedback is pretty good today. So thank you. So Content and Talks looks to be about right for most people. People would mostly agree that they would recommend these to others and that they feel they have learned something new about dementia research. So that's wonderful. Gives us the reason to keep doing them, which is brilliant. And I can tell you more in a minute about what we're planning for next year. So just wait for some slides to pop up, some images to share with you. One of the things that we mentioned in the discussion is a survey that we're currently running. And it's all about trying to understand dementia diagnosis and the experiences of people going through that process. So we're really keen to hear from people who are currently seeking a dementia diagnosis, who've been diagnosed in the last 3 years, or from those who are supporting people either seeking or with a recent diagnosis. And we want to hear from you. And there are a couple of ways that you can support our survey. You could complete it yourself if one of those categories applies to you. You could help someone in your life complete it, and you can share it with others to help us gather more insight. And we're on the final push for this at the moment. It's due to close at the end of Thursday. So we've got a couple more days, and we'll also share a link to the survey with you in the thank you email. And as I said, we've had lots of questions come through today, and I know there are some that we may not have been able to answer, or you might have further follow-up ones, and you might want some more information. And our Dementia Research info line is here to help you. The team can answer questions and signpost on to other organisations. And they can also talk to you about taking part in research as we support a service called Join Dementia Research. And Join Dementia Research matches you with research studies. So anyone over the age of 18 can register. You don't need a dementia diagnosis to take part, and you can find out more on their website or by calling the Dementia Research info line. And we'll be popping details in the chat and in the follow-up emails. And we're busy planning 2025. It's just around the corner, and we have details of our first event ready to share with you. So the first one is taking place on Tuesday, the 18th of March at 1 p.m. And we'll be focusing on treatments in this discussion. And we're focusing on the research that's trying to identify new treatments and use different methods to identify new treatments to treat all different types of dementia. And details of that will be in our thank you email. So that's it. I know we've overrun just a few minutes, but thank you so much for coming along today and taking the time to find out more about dementia research. Thank you for all your support that's got us to this point and your support over the past year. And if you are interested in other ways to get involved or support our work, do check out our website for lots of ways to get involved. And lastly, a huge thank you for joining us today, asking lots of questions and always your interest. I hope you found it useful, and I wish you a peaceful Christmas and an end to 2024. And we hope that you can join us next year. Thank you, everybody, and goodbye.